Welcome to the Recovery.com podcast. I'm Dr. Mala, and today I'm joined by my fellow host, Cliff McDonald. Hi, Cliff.
Hello, Dr. Mala. It's great to be here.
Great to have you. And today we also have a special guest co-host, Josue Valadez. Hi, Josue.
Hi, Dr. Mala. Hi, Cliff.
So we're so excited to welcome Dan Rowe, dedicated advocate for mental health and community support. He was recently featured in Welcome to Wrexham and is a crucial member of Andy's Man Club, a leading suicide prevention charity that offers stigma-free spaces for open discussions about mental health. So excited to have you here, Dan. Welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Pleasure.
We'd love to start by hearing about your personal journey. Could you share with us the experiences that have shaped your path in mental health advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. So, actually, my journey with mental health and talking openly about it started only 8.5 years ago when my son was born. So, I'd never struggled previously with my mental health. I probably sailed through life kind of bouncing from one thing to another and never really taking anything particularly seriously in that aspect. And I
Yeah.
was very lucky that mental health just didn't, or poor mental health just didn't affect me kind of in any way, shape, or form growing up. When my son was born, I was 33, happily married at the time, nice house, nice car, good job, all the kind of things that society says that we should have. And my son was born, he was poorly when he was born, so he was taken off us at an hour old. And I'd gone into becoming a dad thinking that I had one job, and that was reinforced through the whole pregnancy. And that one job was to protect. It was to protect my son and protect my family. So when he was taken away from us, I immediately felt guilt and felt failure. I felt like I'd failed. I was scared. I was emotional. I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what was going to happen to my son. And actually, weirdly, the worst part of the whole that aspect of him being taken on is I physically didn't know where neonatal
Mm,
intensive care unit was in the hospital, so I physically didn't know where my son was. And I remember being in a panic about that and constantly asking the midwife, like, where's my son? Where's my son? To be, oh, he's in
mm,
NICU, he's in NICU. To which I'm kind of going, yeah, I know that, but where is that? I don't know. If I leave this room now, where do I go? Because I don't know where that is in the hospital. And that kind of kick-started a whole chain reaction of events, which I'm sure we'll go into plenty of detail around going forward. But he spent a week in intensive care. There were ups, downs, and everything in between during that week. I changed his first nappy while he was in an incubator, which was an interesting experience as someone that's never changed a nappy before in his life. To do that through an incubator when he's hooked up to all sorts of wires and tubes was interesting to say the least. To just trying to shut off every other feeling other than trying to be strong for everybody else. And that was just something that just reinforced failure for me. Every time I felt emotional, I felt upset. Every time I'd cry, I'd berate myself to say, you're the bloke, that's not what you should be doing. You should be there for everybody else. You should be strong for his mum, for families, for friends, all these kind of things. You should be the one leading the way. And I just didn't feel like I was leading anything, to be honest. I felt like I was barely clinging on myself. And then fast forward, he kind of in that hospital for the first 6 months of his life. He's listening to a very happy, healthy 8.5-year-old boy now. But for those first 6 months, we were unsure about what was going on. He has what's called a coloboma in his eye, which meant his eye didn't form correctly at the time while my ex-wife was pregnant. And normally with a coloboma, it's a sign that there's something more serious at play, because it forms at the same time as all the other major organs. So that's what he was in that hospital for, getting checks on all of those kind of things. And I remember being in the room, kind of seeing everybody having that relief. And when we got the all clear, seeing those smiles and relax, and I just didn't feel it. I just didn't. I struggled because I was just feeling guilty. I was feeling like, man, my son shouldn't be having to go through this. It's got to be my fault. I was meant to protect him, and here we are. And even though he was getting the all clear, I just didn't feel any of that relief. And it was a spiral that I was starting to lose control over my own emotions. I was starting to lose control over how I felt and how I reacted to things, and it deeply affected my life, and still probably does to this day, if I'm truly honest.
Yeah. How does it affect you today? How have you seen the progression of how it affects you from then to now?
Yeah, I think that I'm still unpacking to an extent the damage that I caused myself and the relationships. And being a dad is my proudest achievement. I think every parent obviously says that, and it's probably a given. Actually, I feel like it might be slightly different for me because of the challenges that I went through.
Mhm.
Being a dad was something that I'd always wanted to be, and then I felt just like a failure from day one. And having to being able to build that relationship with my son when he was 2 years old, I lived in the same house as him. I had no relationship with him. I had no connection. My ex-wife quite openly speaks about the fact that at the time she didn't overly trust leaving him alone with me, and not because she ever thought I'd hurt him, but because actually she thought it was unfair on me because she saw how much I was struggling with that relationship. I just didn't know how
Mhm.
to be a dad. I didn't know how to do it. And no matter what I
Mhm.
tried and how hard I worked at that relationship of being a dad and trying to take joy out of that, it was a real challenge. And to be honest, it's still a challenge today. Building, I still question myself every single time in every single thing that I do. And I think that probably the biggest difference in putting things into perspective, and the one thing that I've learned over the last sort of 6.5, 7 years, is actually I know I'm not the only one that struggles with that relationship. It's okay to struggle with that relationship. And you mentioned at the start about being featured in Welcome to Wrexham, and actually taking my son to football, taking him to the Wrexham games, actually was probably one of the most positive things that I've ever been
Mhm.
able to do in building the relationship with my son. And I love my relationship. We get on fantastically well. He's a great boy. I literally couldn't ask for more. But there's still times when I lose my temper a bit too quickly with him, where I find myself struggling. I find myself feeling guilty about things that he's not even aware of. And that's probably where we're at to today. So it's a work in progress.
Sure. But that's always what it is, right? A work in progress. It's so good that you're here. It's so good that you're keeping at it and you're recognizing things as you go to be able to kind of shift the narrative back to one that's proactive and positive and connective. So that's wonderful to see.
Yeah, hey Dan, I really appreciate your vulnerability and your courage. And it's probably a different kind of courage than the courage that you were taught as a young man. I don't know too much about your background, but Dan, I'm in long term recovery, substance use disorder, alcohol. I'm comfortable saying I'm a recovering alcoholic. The 12-step program was huge for me, and that's a big part of my recovery. And I'm also the father of three boys. So there's a thing for moms called postpartum depression. I don't know if there is something that's a little bit similar for the
Yep.
fathers.
Yep.
I, like you, Dan, I have lots of friends that we had bad expectations for what fatherhood was going to be. And I think you have this vision of going to the soccer game or football, I apologize, or going fishing or whatever it might be, right? And, in the beginning, that's the hardest job in the world is taking care of a newborn. And they rely, our species relies so heavily on the mother, right? We're born so young because of the size of our head, and so much development happens after the birth. In your work, and Dr. Mal, it sounds like you might know something about this. Is there a thing similar to postpartum depression? I don't know. I'm not a clinician. Is there something for like the dads that what they go
Yeah,
through after the birth?
absolutely.
Yeah.
So postnatal depression, as I suppose as we call it over here, this side of the pond, affects mums and dads. So the latest studies show that 1 in 10 dads experienced postnatal depression. But bearing in mind that it's such an under-researched kind
Mhm.
of part, because it's only really in the last, certainly in this country, in the last 2 or 3 years that we're actually starting to talk about it. We know that men are 47 times more likely to die by suicide within the first 12 months of becoming a dad. We know that men lose up to a third of their testosterone levels while their partner is pregnant with the first child, and quite a lot of men don't get that testosterone back, which again can have a huge impact and shows. And it's vital that we lose a bit of that testosterone so it enables us to bond and these kind of things. So it's a vital evolutionary kind of process that we have to go through. But the reality is, I think that, and Dr. Marlowe will be able to speak far more scientifically than I can on this, but it's such an important kind of hormone for us to have to maintain our mental health as well. So men's mental health and postnatal depression is huge, in my opinion. I think that it's massively under researched. I think it's such an important topic, and actually I've been lucky to campaign quite heavily over the last sort of 4 or 5 years on this topic specifically. And we're seeing some really good groups that are coming out in the UK. There's a group called Dad Matters UK who support dads through the whole perinatal phase, talk to them about mental health, talk to them about their experiences, but actually take them out of the antenatal classes where they're with the partner and talk to dads just about becoming a dad, which I think is hugely important. They offer peer support, they offer counselling, they offer all these kind of different aspects, which is hugely, hugely important. And I was honoured. I did a podcast. We were commissioned to do a podcast called How Are You Dad?, which goes into a lot of detail around postnatal depression, which I found fascinating because I just learned so much about it.
I just want to share something. I've actually never shared this, and this is triggering a memory. When my oldest son, who's now 21, was a newborn, I had gone out on a Friday night with some people from work, and I was still a very active drinker at that time, and I stayed out too late. And the next day, I was supposed to be watching him, and my wife had plans. I didn't have a good night's sleep. I was hungover, and I spent a day with a 4 or 5 month old, my son, and I was not in good shape to take care of him. And he didn't have a good day. He was crying, and I couldn't calm him down. And I felt so overwhelmed and afraid. Not like I was going to harm him, but I was just so frustrated and I felt inadequate. And I called my dad. And my dad passed away in 2004. This thing that I have is something that has plagued our family and our culture quite a bit. And I shared with him, I tried to be vulnerable. I said, Dad, I'm really struggling with this fatherhood thing. And I got really frustrated with this newborn. And it kind of is like scaring me, the way it made me feel that I'm incapable of calming this young human being down and taking good care of him. And my father started laughing.
Mm.
And I said, What are you laughing at? This isn't funny. He said, It's hard. It's so hard. And no one tells you that. You don't go to school. You don't get a training camp for this. You're just kind of all of a sudden thrown into that. He also shared, and this was very controversial. And again, this isn't me. This is my dad. He said, You're not built for that.
Mm.
He said, You aren't wired the way your wife is for that, for taking care of that. And that could be really misperceived. But I did feel that, I think probably something similar to what you felt. But I never talked about it with my friends. And I'm really glad I was able to have that conversation with my dad. So, Dan, are these the discussions that you're helping to create in your
Yeah,
community?
I think that the fathers' mental health community are trying to. I think there's a couple of things there. I think one is making awareness. I think awareness within this field is really, really important. I mean, let's face it, there's never been as much mental health awareness as there is right now, worldwide, but certainly in the UK. Not all of it's good. I think there's still a lot of virtue signaling going on. I think there's a lot of people wanting to talk about it, but don't seem keen to signpost to actually groups and support that actually could help. Whenever I see what we class as a Z-list celebrity saying my DMs are always open, I cringe consistently about that. However, I think it's important to raise awareness around the fact that it's okay to feel like you're struggling as a dad, and there's a community out there that can support that. But I think the important aspect with any awareness is getting support right. It's knowing where to turn. And I think that's the aspect that, as dads and new dads within the UK, even 5 years ago, there was nowhere to turn. Literally nowhere to turn. The NHS is a great organisation within our country and something that we should all be really proud of. But by their own admission, midwives don't focus on dads.
Mhm.
and are only just starting to ask that question. Health visitors. We had a health visitor that came around. I was the one that was struggling. I was asked to leave the room so that they could talk to my then wife, my ex-wife, to find out if she was okay, but also to find out if I was beating her up, which I get the safeguarding aspect. That's not a problem. But when I came back into the room, having made them a brew or a cup of tea, as because we're very British, was then asked to again leave the room, and because it wasn't a conversation that I should be a part of, and then eventually they left. I was never asked how I was doing, and that's one of the biggest things that we've seen in terms of an improvement in the UK is health visitors being trained to spot signs for not just postnatal depression within mums, but within dads as well, and to start asking that question. And where the How Are You Dad podcast came from is exactly that, the How Are You Dad, to ask that.
Yeah, I love that. I love that there's advocacy and that there's movement towards that. So, one thing that not many people know about me is that, of course, I'm a psychologist by trade, and then I do my work here at Recovery.com as editor in chief, but I'm also a doula. And one of the things that, first of all, just being in psychology, advocating for being aware of the process that both mom and dad go through postnatally is so vital, even prenatally is so vital. And so when I became a doula, I was like, why isn't there anything for dads? That was one of the first questions that I asked. I have 4 children at home, and my husband and I went through what every parent goes through, figuring it out, despite knowing all the things that I know and that he knows. You still are going to experience it your way, right? Everybody's experience is unique. And I was so glad that he and I were able to have the open conversation so that I could check in with him and he could check in with me. It is so vital. But we weren't seeing that around us in our community around us. So not only have I in the past provided doula services for daddies, but so does he. So it's a really wonderful thing to see that there's a movement towards that support. And one of the things that we really, really look to is making sure, of course, that we're doing okay. We're doing those mental health check-ins. We're looking through not just the rigor, right, of the routines that come with a newborn and preparing, but really making sure that we're okay. The mom and dad are both okay. So tell us, with all of this, tell us how Andy's Man Club came about and your involvement with it and all of the wonderful things that the club is doing.
8 years ago, a young 23-year-old lad called Andy Roberts, based in Halifax in West Yorkshire, which is again another hard-working northern town, very kind of tough industrial type town. At 23, for reasons that we'll never 100% know, decided that he would take his own life. His brother-in-law, a chap called Luke Ambler, who was a professional rugby league player. Now, the best way I can describe to an American audience what rugby league is, imagine American football, but without the pads and the helmet. If I can recommend one thing, and we're getting off topic slightly, but if I can recommend one thing, is watch rugby league.
I played American football in college here, and we had a good rugby club at my school. Yeah, that's no joke. That's intense. It's a beautiful game too.
There's two different rugbies.
But probably lots of trauma, and I know the head injuries and CTE and all that stuff. That's a whole separate podcast too.
100%.
Yeah, don't get me started on that.
Yeah,
there's two separate rugbies in the UK. There's rugby union, which is probably more internationally recognised, which is like the rugby sevens that you probably see, and then rugby league, which is mainly played in the UK, Australia, and New Zealand. But yeah, I highly recommend checking that out. So he was a professional rugby league player, so he's a big guy. He's 6'4", however many stone kilos. He's a large guy. He's also larger than life in terms of character. Him and Andy's mum, his mother-in-law, kind of looked around and said, well, where do guys go? If guys have got an issue or a problem, where do they actually go? Where can they turn to? They realized that for whatever reason, even though that they would always be there, Andy didn't feel like he could talk. He didn't feel like there was somewhere to go to talk about whatever the issues that he had going on within that time. So they wanted to stop other families going through that. So Luke played for Halifax Rugby League. He put a message out on Facebook that he'd be at a certain place, certain time. Any guy out there that just kind of wanted to come along and have a chat, have a drink, non-alcoholic drink, and see what other guys are going through and all that kind of stuff, and create that small community. We saw 9 guys walk through the door that night. So straight away, that was kind of the creation of what Andy's Man Club would eventually or would become. 2 weeks after that first session, a week after that first session, we saw 15 guys through the door. So we saw that progression. And then 2 weeks after that, Luke was really keen to kind of sort of kickstart that conversation, right? 2016, suicide wasn't a topic that was ever really spoken about in any kind of domain. It was probably the start point of, or that kind of time where social media was really exploding and social media campaigns were just about starting, if you like. So he started a social media campaign called the It's Okay to Talk campaign, taking a selfie with the internationally recognized sign of It's Okay, and shared it with It's Okay to Talk with the hashtag across Twitter. Expected it to reach the rugby league community. Still to this day, it's the biggest social media campaign around mental health in the world. Over 100 million people worldwide got involved. We saw the likes of Ricky Gervais getting involved, with Russell Crowe getting involved, and kind of sports stars, actors, actresses. But we saw the world effectively come together to celebrate that. The biggest thing, and probably the biggest secret, is the fact that it was actually this strange Yorkshireman that actually started the whole thing. So we kickstarted that. They looked at it then saying, well, actually, there's a need. We saw 9, then we saw 15. Come through the door, there's a need. There's an absolute need. So what can we do? Can we open more clubs? What does that look like? So we set an agenda. And I say we, I wasn't around at that time in terms of involved with the charity, but the charity set an agenda. They wanted 10 clubs within 5 years. They thought it was ambitious. On our 5th birthday, we opened our 50th club. 8 years old now. We've just had our 8th birthday. And on Monday, and we meet every Monday, on Monday in the UK, we'll be opening our 200th club.
Oh my goodness.
We now,
Amazing.
200 clubs in the UK. We now see just shy of 4,700 men attend our groups every single week. So as a charity, we're going from strength to strength, really from strength to strength, which is great. My involvement came 6.5 years ago, 8th of Jan 2018. 6th of Jan, I'd made the 3rd attempt at my own life within the previous 2 years since my son had been born. That's where life had got me to. 2 days earlier, I'd felt probably as low, if not lower, than I'd ever felt. My ex-wife was great with supporting me, and I knew all about the charity, so I'm a rugby league fan. My mate played rugby with Luke, so I was aware of Luke as well. I'd met Luke in the past. I'd even recommended Andy's Man Club to a lad who worked for me. But I was still of that mentality, of that mindset that talking about your feelings was weak and it wasn't what a man did, and all these kind of nonsense stereotypes that we all know and probably have embraced at some point within our lives. But that was my way of thinking. And in the nicest possible way, I was kind of given an ultimatum that if I wanted to stay within the house, then I needed to go. And she said that, listen, every time you're not in the house and my phone rings, I'm dreading who's on the other end of that call. And that's not a way that we can continue to live. So I walked through the door as a tick box exercise, literally to go home, say it doesn't work, but I've tried it, and go back to what I was doing, which at the time, if I'm really honest now, looking back in hindsight, I was just feeling sorry for myself. Yes, I had all sorts of stuff that was going on and I was struggling, but I was also feeling comfort in that struggle. And at that time, I didn't have probably the motivation really to understand how to even get out of that. I didn't understand how I actually felt. I just know that I didn't want to carry on feeling like that, but didn't see a positive outcome out of that. I only saw one way in which life was going to go for me, and that was for life to end in that aspect. So walking through the door, 5 minutes after the start of the group, and we go through 5 questions on a Monday, which I'll go into a bit in a moment. But our first question is always, how's your week been? And there was a guy, a stranger that I'd never met, big smile on his face, been attending for a couple of months, and was talking about his week, but really about his weekend. And he said, listen, I've had the kids this weekend. He said, I've struggled being a dad at times, but I've had a great weekend with my kids. In fact, I've never felt closer to them than I do right now. I walked through the door that night living with a 2-year-old, as I mentioned before, that I just had no connection with my 2-year-old. I had no relationship with it. I just didn't know how to be a dad. But worst of all, I walked through the door feeling just lonely and isolated, feeling like I was the only guy in the world that struggled being that dad. And here's this guy, and this stranger was smiling, saying that I've been where you are now, and look at me now, in effect. Like, I'm loving being a dad. Like, it's great. I feel so connected with my children. And just my head was straight away just thought, wow. And to put it into context, when I left that night, I didn't feel like this massive transformation. We get a lot of that within Andy's Man Club. I love hearing those stories, but that wasn't it for me. Marginal, 1%. I said it in the
Mm-hmm.
documentary. I felt 1% better when I left that night, and that was enough to commit to going back the following week. And that
Mm-hmm.
same commitment just kept me going through those first couple of months, first 6 months or so, that really started to improve. I started to learn how to talk, which is something that still at home to this day. And if you spoke to my partner, she would say that I'm the worst at it. I'm all right apparently on media stuff, but at home I still find difficult. But generally speaking, I learned a skill that I'd not had for 33 years, and that was to talk about vulnerability. That was to admit to how you actually feel and start to understand how you feel. I had that much going on in my head that actually talking about things like how my week had been, talking about hearing how other people's weeks have been, hearing how other people's issues, to start to kind of connect the dots. And I think that was a really powerful, gradual process that I went through. And do you know what? I'm 6.5 years in. I get as much from an Andy's Man Club today than I ever did when I first went through. It's very different now. Working for the charity is very, very different to attending, because you're looking at all sorts of things when you attend a group. But I still answer all the questions. I still talk about it. If I'm going through a tough time, I'll expose that kind of vulnerability, because I believe in it. I think that it works. And I think there was a lot of factors that have kept me alive to this day within that period of time. And Andy's Man Club is a big contributing factor.
That sense of being able to connect with other people, which we know depression, anxiety, all of it, addiction, all of it is a disease of isolation. We end up isolating ourselves and then feeling comfortable with that isolation. And that's kind of what I'm hearing you went through. And then you found this sense of connection. And connection, as we know, is so healing. Cliff, I know you have so much to say about that as well. There's this really beautiful collaboration between in your story between mental health advocacy and sports. How did that kind of weave itself together into your life, and how did you figure that out for yourself, that this could be a tool, this is something that helps, etc.?
Yeah, I mean, listen, sports played a huge role throughout my whole life. Football or soccer, whichever you want to describe it as, was ever since I've been old enough to hold onto a ball when I was a baby, to kick a ball. I had a brother that was 3 years older than me, so he was always a goalkeeper, which was great because I was always a striker. So normally it's the younger one that has to go in goal for his older brother and his mates to kick the ball as hard as they can at and try and make him cry. I was thankfully that I didn't have that experience. We lived in a quiet village in North Wales. We were lucky in terms of that on the street that we lived at is a cul-de-sac. I don't know whether that translates over there, but I'm presuming it does. So we were able to play on the street constantly. It was quiet. There was a park over the road. We went out in the morning at the weekends, played football for our team, and then we came back and we met up as mates and we played more football, and then we played some more football, and then you came back for your lunch and then your tea, and then you go out again, and just we were obsessed. And I've played a lot of sports. Cricket is a big sport of mine. In fact, I've spent, as we record today, it's England are playing or just started playing the West Indies in the Test match. It's Jimmy Anderson's last Test, so cricket still plays a big role. In fact, probably other than golf is the only sport I can now play,
Mm.
being a man over the age of 40 and not as fit as I used to be. So yeah, sports plays a huge role, and sport plays a huge role in Andy's Man Club. Now, let's not get away from the fact that our founder, our co-founder, is a professional or ex-professional sportsman. But I think the reality is we use a lot of sports clubs to host our groups, right? So there's, of the 200 groups, I'd say 140 give or take, are within sports clubs. Now, they could be football, rugby, cricket, whatever, including, we mentioned Man City at the Etihad Stadium. We have a club based there. It's important to us for a couple of reasons. One, Monday nights are when we meet. So every Monday night from 7 till 9, completely free of charge. That's apart from bank holidays. That's the only time when we don't operate on a Monday. Monday nights are really quiet nights for a lot of sports clubs. They have these big rooms, these big hospitality suites that are available. They want to support their community. They want to support their supporter base, which is mainly men. There's a good synergy there as well. But the crux of it is, for me, I think, is as a bloke, where are we most likely to feel most comfortable walking through the door? Are we most likely to walk through the door and feel comfortable going through a clinical environment? So if we had it a doctor's surgery or within a hospital, are we going to see more guys turning up at that sort of setting? Or are we going to see them walking through the sports club? Whether they're a sports fan or not, it doesn't matter.
I'm surprised that, or what my guess would be the most popular, comfortable place would be the pub. But I'm curious, what type of overlap do you have with Andy's Man Club and substance use disorder and recovery? Are there a lot of people in those rooms who also are recovering alcoholics?
Yeah, it's quite interesting here again, looking at the landscape of the UK. We're seeing more and more pubs close. We're seeing more and more young people not interested in drinking at all. I do quite a bit of work within a few universities, and actually they're getting more and more calls on Freshers Week that don't involve alcohol. Younger people aren't driven in the same way that my generation was probably driven. So you're right in terms of the pub being that. Now, none of our venues have an open bar within the room. None of our venues have gambling. None of our venues have, within that aspect, none of our venues have under 18s on site as and when we meet. And it's really important to us from a safeguarding point of view that we provide these spaces for guys to turn up and feel as comfortable as they can feel. We see large numbers, as you can imagine, of guys that struggle with alcohol, with drugs, and various gambling as well in terms of addictions. So yeah, it's absolutely common to do that. There's no open bar on site, so nobody can get a drink. And it's important that, and while we don't have a zero alcohol policy in terms of if somebody needs a pint to turn up because they feel anxious, that's okay. If you're turning up blind drunk, then that's not okay. You won't be allowed in, especially if you're being disruptive. So we want to support people until they're ready to take that step. And if they need to take a couple of pints before they turn up, but then start to talk about their issues and start to realize that they don't need those couple of pints, then we actively encourage people to do that. But we want to provide that supportive environment. There's no, within Andy's Man Club, we often say that, listen, there's no experts in the room. We don't have counsellors. Well, we do have counsellors in the room. We do have doctors in the room, but they're there using it for them. They're not using it as a professional. There's no advice given. There's no telling people what they should or shouldn't be doing. There's no judgment within our groups. It's really important that by sharing that community and feeling part of that community, you realize that maybe there's better ways to do things. Maybe you get that support that's what needed, as well as clinical support outside of what our groups do. But there's no one checking in to make sure that you're doing what you're saying you're doing. These are the spaces. If you want to do that, we'll support you. But this isn't school, right? We're not going to check to make sure that you've done it. That's on you to take that responsibility. And until you're ready to take that responsibility, we'll still hear, we'll listen, we'll support you in any way that we can, and the groups will in any way that they can, until they're ready to take that responsibility. And for that, people, that's different times.
I'm so glad that you said that too, because providers oftentimes feel compelled to provide, right? And be in that status. So to have a space that's safe to be able to just go to and be and process their own burdens and issues and just talk and be okay with talking is a wonderful thing. So that's great to hear. Cliff, I know you had a comment. Go ahead. Yeah.
I was just curious, and I love meet them where they are, right? And that's such a great approach. And rigid structures of compliance don't work well in many environments. Andy's Man Club, two things. Is there an international expansion plan? I haven't heard of it or seen it across the pond. And then I'd love to hear what a meeting is like. I go to 12-step meetings all the time. I love walking into rooms and connecting with that identification and similarity is just wonderful. So the two things that are there international expansion plans for this Andy's Man's Club, and what's a meeting
Okay,
typically
so we'll
like?
take the expansion plans first. We're 15% of the way in terms of total number of groups that we want in the UK. So I think expansion, listen, never say never. And I've offered my services to start Andy's Man Club in both America and in Australia. So never say never, but it's not on our radar at this moment in time until we get to where we want to get to. And like I said, we're about 15% of the way in terms of total number of groups. We actually, as a weird aside, we base the number of clubs that we want to have or we think that we need based on how many McDonald's there are in the UK. And the reason for that is, and I didn't realize this, but McDonald's base how many, I'm not going to call them restaurants, that is a stretch, but how many outlets have is based
Yeah.
on population numbers within that region. So we see
Mhm.
ourselves as having something similar in terms of a target demographic around that area. So that's kind of where we've picked our figure, or our trustees have picked the figure out. Is that so? A meeting, if I talk you through, you get out your car or you walk or you turn up at the venue. We start at 7. There's always facilitators outside each venue at 6:30. They're always wearing Andy's Man Club clothing, so hoodie or cap or t-shirt or things like that. They're easily recognizable. So again, we use a lot of sports venues. Some sports venues have other things going on during that time, so it's really important to us. We know how anxious people, how worried people are, whether or not they feel like they're making the right decision, all these kind of different bits and pieces around that. So if we can make that easier by, you can see straight away that you're in the right place because you can see our representatives there. Fingers crossed they've got a smile on their face. But that's that. So we'll meet you at the door. It's really, really important to us that we meet people at the door. We'll show guys into the venue. We have a tea and coffee station that will already be set up. So we will welcome people in. We will make them a cup of tea or coffee. There'll be a fair amount of very average biscuits on offer as well. Some of our clubs are lucky that local members of the community decide that they'd like to bake products for them. But interestingly enough, that as we grow is becoming a slight issue with things like allergies and stuff like that, and something that is on our radar now about allowing people to cook brownies and all sorts of different things on there. So we'll make you feel as comfortable as possible. So we have like what we class as a guideline sheet. So one of the facilitators will read that out at the start of a group. And it's basically just says, listen, the group's confidential. Nothing that's said within this room leaves this room. The only caveat is a safeguarding. If there's a safeguarding issue, we'll break that confidentiality. If there's life at risk, either an individual or someone else's life at risk, people can feel comfortable. Guys can feel comfortable to talk about anything they want to. Apart from, there's 4 topics that we don't cover within our groups. So the first topic we don't cover is medication. Mentioned before, we're not professionals and no one is acting on a professional basis. So telling people what they should or shouldn't be taking is very, very dangerous. So we don't do that. The other 3 topics are down to the fact we don't want any arguing or certainly don't want any fighting. I'm sure we can probably all work out what 2 of them are, but we don't talk about politics. We don't talk about religion, and we don't talk about criminal activity. Now, criminal activity is something that actually we've recently brought in within the last 12 months. And that's because over the previous 2 years, we saw an increasing number of safeguarding issues that came down
Mm.
to previous or current criminal activity and prosecutions and things along those lines. We welcome people that have served time in prison within our groups. We have a large population, but there's an element of that we don't talk about crime in terms of specific detail with regards to that. In Scotland as well, there's an additional one. Is in Scotland they're not allowed to talk about football or soccer. I don't know how much you guys know about Scottish football, probably very little. But if you think of Rangers and Celtic, Catholic, Protestant, it's just not worth it. It's really just not worth it. It goes the whole kind of Northern Ireland kind of history. If you ever have an hour or 10 and you want to kind of research the issues that causes, it's very significant.
Really?
They don't talk about football, and we're always conscious. We always say, listen, if you want to talk about football, it's great, but it's not going to take over the conversation. So I always say, like, listen, football means a lot to me, but it becomes very boring very quickly, especially if you're not a fan. people, guys that are religious, they're free to talk about religion if they're involved and the way that it impacts them. What we won't do is get onto a conversation about should you have religion in your lives, and or I don't believe that religion exists. All these kind of, I don't need to tell you guys exactly what was sort of thing. So talk about it, but we're not discussing it. And the same goes with kind of football as well. Politics we won't we'll touch at all, because it's just not worth it's just not worth that at all. So they'll go through those guidelines, put your phone on silent, and then we go through within our group. So we'll do, first of all, we'll do your name and a positive reason for walking through the door. So we'll be sat in a circle. We have a football. So the ball is what we class as a talking ball. 2 reasons for the ball. One, it kind of highlights who's speaking, gives everyone the opportunity to listen, most importantly. And the second thing is, and this comes from the really early days of Andy's Man Club, is the one thing that we find in terms of barriers that stops people and guys from talking is they're looking for almost any excuse, really. And a guy in one of our early sessions said that all he could think about was what his hands were doing while he was talking. So as guys, one of them had a football, threw the ball. Well, if you hold that ball, that's one less thing to think about. It's one less barrier in place that's going to stop you from talking. So they're the kind of 2 aspects around that. So we all say your name, just your first name. If you want to make it up, you can do. It's up to you. And then positive reason, as I said, for walking through those doors. Everyone goes around, has that. We tend to do that in one big group, and then depending on the group size, we'll split into smaller groups. Our optimum number is between 12 and 15 within a group. We have groups that see over 80 guys that turn up, so they'll separate into smaller groups to keep that 12 to 15 kind of ratio. And then I mentioned before, we go through 5 questions. So the first 3 questions are the same every single week. So question 1, how's your week been? Question 2, for me, most important question of the night, name one positive from your week. So again, no matter how bad your week's been, there's always something there. Let's find it. Let's work hard on that. Question 3, anything to get off your chest. So it's the big question for a lot of our guys. Talk about the reasons why they're there, what they're struggling with. It's kind of the bit where people tend to go into a bit more detail around that. We then have a break at the end of that question, time dependent, 5 or 10 minutes, just go and fill the coffee cups up again and get some more very stale average biscuits. And then questions 4 and 5 change every week, always positive questions. So again, it's no coincidence for us that 3 out of our 5 questions are directly positive, and you could class 4 out of 6 if you include our intros as well. Question 4 is always a positive affirmation, so finding something past, present, or future that's either brought or will bring you happiness. And then question 5 is always very light-hearted, very, very light-hearted. An example of a question 5, one that the lads always love, is what is your guilty pleasure song? So what's the one song that you really shouldn't like and you're a bit obsessed? That for us is, we want to end with people smiling. We want to end the group with people laughing and joking. We want guys to feel better when they leave. As I mentioned, through my own experience, I saw a 1% difference in terms of that. I didn't smile, I didn't laugh, life wasn't great. But as things started to improve, I really started to embrace that. And there's always laughter. Our groups are filled with laughter. Don't get me wrong, they're filled with guys crying, they're filled with guys getting frustrated, getting angry with whatever they've got going on. But I've never been to a group in 6.5 years that hasn't been littered with laughter. And I think that, as you mentioned, Dr. Marla, before, about the power of community is so important to people that are struggling with their mental health. Well, not just their mental health, but their health in general and their well-being in general. But for me, there's no better way to build connection with people, with a community, than laughing with each other. And generally, we laugh at ourselves, and that's something that goes such a long way. There's no laughing at other people about their answers. It's we laugh at ourselves, because we see, no matter what our demographic is, no matter what our age is, no matter what our issues are, I think one of the most powerful things about Andy's Man Club is actually we see ourselves in each and every single person that sat there in that circle in some way, shape, or form.
I'm curious, Dan, just on the demographic of age with Andy's Man Club. I'm 28 years old, a little bit on the younger side, and I've noticed, as we've talked about, that younger people are willing to talk about mental health. And a good example in the UK, Dr. Mala and Cliff. So it's the Euros right now, which is, it's kind of like the World Cup, but just for Europe. And 4 years ago, in the previous World Cup, the previous Euros, 3 young English footballers missed a goal in the penalty kicks rounds and they ended up losing the championship game. And they received a lot of abuse online for that, which caused a lot of conversation about mental health in sports and social media. And people were willing to talk about it. People were willing to make changes. And I know that they've made a lot of great organizations to help young footballers and mental health. I'm just kind of curious with Andy's Man Club, the demographic. Is it younger people who are coming? Is it older? How does that look like at Andy's Man
Yeah,
Club?
I'm not call it a sweet spot, but probably. I mean, we don't ask for people's ages, so a lot of this is anecdotal, really, my point of view. But actually, I say that the vast majority of people that come through our door are probably between the ages of 35 and 55, which incidentally is probably the highest risk group in the UK for male suicide. We need to do more attracting young people through. And we are doing that. We're in the process of doing that. And I think there's a couple of reasons for that. And I'll give you a couple of caveats as well. We have a couple of clubs that are based smack bang in the city centre of Manchester, smack bang in the city centre of Liverpool. They see a much, much younger demographic that walk through their door than, let's say, a town like Oldham or Halifax, who tend to see older people. So there's a couple of things, there's a couple of aspects here. From a social media point of view, because we're worried about putting our volunteers, and all of our facilitators are volunteers, we have over 2,200 volunteers within our charity. We're worried about putting them in a situation that's just not fair. So we restrict what social media each group can use to Facebook, because we can disable direct messaging on Facebook. We can't do that on Instagram. We can't do that on Twitter or X or whatever it's called nowadays. We also can't do that on TikTok, I believe. I've never used TikTok as a man in his 40s, and I'm proud and never will use TikTok, if I'm honest. But until 2 months ago, and his Man Club didn't have a TikTok account. So if you want to attract younger people through the door, what social media do we use mainly? We use Facebook, which is basically, it's my age group, isn't it? So we are addressing that in terms of who we work with, who we engage with, and making sure that we're covering all bases to attract. We've got to bring in more young people into our groups, because we do have instances where guys, a young 19, 20, 21-year-old will walk through the door, be surrounded by guys in their 40s and 50s and go, my God, it's like I'm sat with my dad. When I talk about having that, I can see a bit of everybody within myself. As a 21-year-old, can you sit there listening to people at 50 talking about whatever their issues are? As a 21-year-old, are you honestly going to go, yeah, I get what you're saying there? You're probably not. So there's more work that we can do, and we are addressing that. We brought a new social media content creator who in herself, she's 19 years old, and is just phenomenal. The work that she's done, even in a short space of time, within our social media following, is just phenomenal in terms of what we brought. A video content creator who's a guy that we've used in the past, again, is brilliant. So that actually our social media input, if you looked at it over the last 3 months compared to the last 12 months, is so different. It's so different. And it's not about just targeting it at certain groups, which I think we need to do. It's about making it appeal to more and more people. We need to do that with all demographics. I'm not just talking about young people, I'm talking about people from different backgrounds. We obviously in the UK are very, very diverse, and different areas of the country. We need to do more, and we're by no means a perfect organisation. The one thing that I have complete confidence is, no matter who you are, what your age is, what your demographic is, what your background is, whatever your sexuality is, anything along those lines, you walk through the door of Andy's Man Club, you'll be welcomed with a warm smile, a handshake, you'll be made a brew, and you'll be made to feel really, really comfortable. But the one thing that we need to make sure is that there's always people within there, and we've got to break down those barriers within those different cultures to really ensure that everybody feels welcome, even though they all are welcome. And I think that's a nuance sometimes that we could do more on, if I'm honest.
So, is there a powerful moment or breakthrough that occurred during one of your meetings that particularly stands out that you could share with us? Because I think one of the things that is really important for our audience is to hear more of the fact that they're not alone. So, I'd love to hear if there were any particularly powerful breakthrough moments that stand out for you.
I'd love to say that there's loads of that, but I think that from the way I see it, we have that every week.
Mhm.
within our groups. From a personal point of view, I opened a group in Altrincham, which is part of Greater Manchester. It's a very middle class kind of environment. We saw a guy that took 6 weeks to even speak, attended every week, passed the ball on, which is all good. There's no obligation to talk. We want people to feel comfortable. Took them 6 weeks.
Yeah.
After 6 weeks, he answered one question out of the 5. That was a powerful breakthrough
Yeah.
because that's huge. The week after, he answered 3 of the 5 questions. These are really, really powerful things. I tell the same story around this because I think that for me, it's probably one of the most memorable experiences I've been in, and always makes me laugh if I'm honest. So again, at the Altrincham group. So Altringham's really close to a town called Audley Edge, which is where a lot of the Premier League footballers live. You're struggling to find a house for less than £1,000,000 there. It's very posh. There's just sports cars everywhere. It's that kind of environment. You get where I'm coming from. We had a
Mhm.
young lad who was in his 20s who used to attend from Audley Edge, who described himself as he was a rapper. He was a white guy who was a rapper. He spoke differently to anybody I've ever met before in my life. I could barely understand what he said. Words that he said a load of words that I just didn't understand as a 40-year-old man. I'll be honest, and because he was young and potentially trendy. And within our group as well, we had a 75-year-old ex armed forces, Royal Navy,
Mm.
recovering alcoholic, and who was so set in their ways, as you can imagine, someone that worked in the armed forces for 30 years and that kind of life, if you like. And this young lad was talking about something, and I can't remember even the detail of what he said, but anyway, he finished talking, and straight away, Jeremy, the ex armed forces guy, just said, "Do you know what? I've never thought of it that way. I'm going to do that. I'm going to try that." And that for me
Ugh.
was like, there's no way that these two people will ever come into contact with each other than Andy's Man Club. It just would not happen. So to have something like that is just incredible. And speaking of Jeremy, and probably really relevant for you guys, is Jeremy came to us in his early 70s, having been sober for 30 days. And his
Mm.
highlight of the week was, I've not had a drink for 30 days. He lost his wife to the effects of alcoholism. They were both alcoholics together. And to this day, he's not had a drink. Now, I've not seen Jeremy for a while. I don't know what number he's at, but he's been attending Andy's Man Club for 3.5 years now, I'd say. And I remember
That's so
him saying 30 days, and just there wasn't a lot of us there at that time, but everyone just kind of round of applause. That's amazing. That's so good. And I remember him saying to me at the end, he was like, I didn't think people would think 30 days was that impressive. It's just 30 days. And I was like, you've not come to a place like ours before. If you'd said, I've not had a drink for one day, we would have applauded you and said how amazing that was
Well,
as an
also
achievement.
probably the first time he said 30 days since he was 16 years
Even
old,
younger,
probably.
even younger.
That's crazy. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah,
and
right, right.
and now he's been
Yeah. So for a time in 55 years or 58 years, that's impressive, man. That's a great
yeah.
story.
So
yeah. Dan,
we see that across the board, which is something that we're really proud of.
for anyone listening who might be struggling in silence, could you offer some words of encouragement or advice on taking that first step towards seeking help and coming into the club?
Yeah, I think for us, and the one thing that I will stress is obviously we're a UK based charity. You do need to live in the UK to attend our group either virtually or in person. The biggest challenge is if you don't change, then nothing will change. So if people are sit and listening to this chat and thinking, "Oh, I'd like to go to an Andy's Man Club, or I'd like to go to AA, or I'd like to go to some kind of group where they may feel like the stigma attached to attending a group like ours or something similar," is you've got nothing to lose. If you're thinking about going, then there's obviously a want and a desire for your life to improve. So what have you got to lose? It's one night. Come, turn up. Don't
Mhm.
listen. Don't feel that you need to be involved. That's okay. Just come and listen to how other people talk. One of the biggest things that I see week in, week out is when you see the guy that's there for the first time looking around going, shit, man, I didn't realize that guys talk like this. I've never been involved in an environment where guys will be as open as they are and someone not say, don't be stupid. It's always a, man, that's really, really good. Well done in terms of being able to share that. If anyone's thinking, and this isn't just for men, if anyone's thinking about getting that help, getting that support, by even thinking that, you've taken that first step. The next step is difficult. It's really, really hard to go and ask for help. It's really hard to put yourself in that situation where you're vulnerable enough to know that you need support and that you need help. But unless you want something to change, you've got to change. You've got to make that step, because it's a step that you won't regret.
Love it. All right, I've got one more question, but before I ask it, does anybody else have anything else that they wanted to talk about or ask?
I mean, I was kind of curious on the guilty pleasure
Yeah.
song.
I mean, I'm more than happy to answer. I'm 100% sure that the three of you will never have heard of what this is. I think it's a very nuanced reference in terms of a UK reference. So we have the TV presenters now called Ant and Dec. They're from Newcastle in the northeast. They started out in a kids' TV drama called Biker Grove, which was set in Newcastle. In fact, they were in the same TV drama as the lead character from Sons of Anarchy. He's a British guy. He was in that TV. There's a very loose connection. Anyway, when they left that TV drama, they were probably about 17 or 18, something along those lines. They released a song called Let's Get Ready to Rumble. And they did it with their character names from this TV drama. So the PJ and Duncan, Let's Get Ready to Rumble. And yeah, and now they're so famous over here in terms of TV presenters. They're very well liked as well. But yeah, it's a shocker. How about you guys?
That's so great. We
You
have
must
a
have some.
Honestly, I think mine might be. I mean, it's kind of not that controversial, but "Spice Up Your Life" by the Spice Girls is a
I'd say that
great
is
one.
controversial.
Or "Wanna Be" with any Spice
Wow.
Girl song. Yeah.
That's so good. We have a channel at work on our communications in Slack. It's called Daily Jam. So I'm pretty sure one of us are going to find that song and share.
Yeah, I overcame that. I've got plenty of work to do. Lots of character defects remain here. But I overcame that a long time ago. Duke Ellington, famous jazz musician, said a long time ago, if it sounds good, it is good. And whatever makes you move, man, right? It's interesting. There's so much pretentiousness in the arts, right? And people who are experts saying this is quality, this isn't. The whole goal of that is to help have positive emotions, right? So, man, if you find yourself moving to the groove, stay with that groove. So,
I love it. I love it.
Definitely not seeing
So good.
groove.
Yeah. All right. Our last question that we ask everyone, Dan, is what does recovery mean to you?
It's an interesting topic. I suppose I don't see myself as recovering. I don't see myself in recovery or in terms of, or put that kind of label on that. For me, recovery, I suppose, is living my life how I want to live it. I'm a much better person, a much better human, a so much better dad than I ever would have been had I not gone through the challenges that I went through. I'm a better partner now to my partner now than I ever was, probably to my ex-wife. And me and my ex-wife are really good friends and we've not fallen out. But I think that what my experiences has given me is purpose. I never would have worked within mental health. I never would have looked at how I treat people, look at how I use social media, look at how I interact with individuals or collective. I would never have changed my philosophies and just understand who I am. I feel more comfortable in my own skin today than I ever have done in the previous, well, certainly before my son was born. So my experiences have molded me and shaped me, and to the point that I'm actually just started. I didn't go to university or college, as you guys call it. I've just started a university course at the age of 41 years old. I mean, who does that? Ironically, in psychology as well. So it's an area that it's an area that truly fascinates me, and it's opened my mind, and I'm far more inquisitive now than I ever have done. I've got a much better mindset for learning and wanting to be proved wrong and challenging my own limitations, really. So from that aspect, although I might not term it recovery, that's exactly what it is, right? It's going through an experience and learning and moving and shaping that journey forward to how I want to do that. To my purpose is to make a positive impact on the world. and that's every day.
Mm.
So with that and my interactions in how I communicate with people, how I interact with them, whether that's through social media, whether that's through in person, it's to try and leave each and every single person feeling positive about coming into contact with me as a human. And I can tell you now that that was not my outlook 8.5, 9 years ago. And that's something that I'm truly grateful for now.
Dan, I've got news to share with you, brother. You are 100% living life in recovery. And you're a shining example of what can happen when we go through difficult things and how we emerge better, stronger. And you're doing such inspirational work, man.
Yeah.
I hope we get some more time together. I love what you're doing, man. Keep going.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
That's absolutely true. Absolutely true. I mean, we all have unique journeys, and there's always things that we need to work through and overcome and figure out. And that in and of itself makes everyone on, or puts everyone on, some kind of a recovery journey. So, what is the one thing that we always say here, Cliff, right? We're all recovering from something. So, Dan, it is so clear to see, just, mirroring what Cliff said, that you are doing that. You're doing it well. And I'm so thankful for all the wonderful work that you are doing, and this advocacy, which I think we definitely need more of globally. So thank you. Thank you for everything that you're doing and for sharing your story today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for the invite. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thanks so much, Dan.
Cheers.
We'll see you soon.
Thanks,
Bye-bye.
Dan.